1966 is often referred to as the year psychedelic rock began. The Beatles, heavily influenced by artists like Bob Dylan, had reinvented themselves. Their album Rubber Soul had shifted their sound dramatically with a mix of country, folk, gospel and French ballads. Their lyrics had matured, evolved, no longer simplistic. Their words ranged from thought-provoking to mournful. They were transitioning, distancing themselves from their pop sound and developing a taste for avant-garde music. They'd each purchased tape recorders where at home they were experimenting with distortion. Distorted effects were becoming more and more popular. Music, in fact, was mimicking the effects of a new drug known as LSD.
Give yourself a real kick. Yes, a kick in the head.
The psychedelic movement had now reached swinging London. American psychologist and author Timothy Leary, who strongly advocated the effects of psychedelic substances, had been arrested for drug possession and sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. His book, The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, had caught the attention of John Lennon. The Beatles had now begun what was later known as their psychedelic years. John and George, who'd first taken LSD the year previous, had developed a big interest in Indian and Chinese philosophies. Ringo had followed suit when they urged him to try LSD, but Paul had refused. Paul at this time had developed an interest in London's avant-garde art scene. At around the same time across the ocean in California, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys was also transitioning. In May, he would release Pet Sounds. A dramatic change from his previous work, the album featured no surf songs, references to cars, jingly guitars, or catchy hooks. Like Revolver, the album's psychedelic lyrics were both introspective while based on emotional longings and self-doubts. The two albums, released months apart, were psychedelic rock masterpieces. The Revolver sessions would see George come into his own as a songwriter, Paul bring avant-garde experimentation, and John requests to be suspended upside down from the ceiling to record his vocals. This is the story of the Beatles' Revolver. Sessions for Revolver began on April 6th. George Martin again as producer, and 20-year-old Geoff Emerick had been promoted to sound engineer. The arrangement of Emerick and George Martin suited both perfectly. George Martin wanted to be in charge. He didn't want his authority challenged. Besides, Geoff Emerick was more interested in experimenting with sounds on the mixing board. The fact that the Beatles had no plans to reproduce the music for live performance only gave Emerick more freedom. At this time, EMI sessions weren't allowed to run past 11 PM, but these rules didn't apply to the Beatles. They were big enough they could work as late and as long as they wanted. As for the staff, they had to fit themselves around whatever schedule they were given. On April 6th, the Beatles arrived in the studio rejuvenated, refreshed and firing on all cylinders. The first song they began with was titled Mark I. It would later be changed to Tomorrow Never Knows. It was in fact a musical representation of an acid trip. Lennon had picked out the vocals from Timothy Leary's book. He lifted phrases such as, whenever in doubt, turn off your mind, relax, float downstream. He first played the song on guitar for Paul. Paul liked it, but he feared George Martin's reaction. The song only had 2 chords. When John played it for Martin, rather than being put off, he saw a potential in what they could create. As John was playing, he muttered, yes, I see, The only problem was, the song wasn't finished. Paul and John struggled to come up with more than 2 verses. They felt they'd already said everything they wanted. With no middle 8 or distinguishable chorus, they decided the instrumentation would be key. Immediately, the experimentation began. The next day, John and Ringo brought in tape loops. They contained distorted sounds that the group found interesting, and they decided to use them for the song. Inspired, Paul went home and created his own on his tape recorder. The next day, Paul would appear with a plastic bag full of tape loops with experimental sounds. They sat in the control room listening to distorted guitars that sounded like seagulls, wine glasses and other bizarre noises. They played them in every which way they could, sped up, slowed down, backwards, forwards. Every so often, one of the four would shout, "That's a good one." 5 of the loops were added to the basic backing track they had recorded. It was the first time in a pop record this had ever been done. For the vocals, John requested to be hung upside down by a rope and rotated around the microphone. Martin dismissed the idea, arguing they get a much better sound if John wasn't swinging from the ceiling. The reason he'd requested this is because he'd told George Martin he wanted to sound like the Dalai Lama singing from the mountains. He even suggested piling up the furniture so he could stand above everyone and create that feeling. George Martin went through ideas of how to achieve a Tibetan effect on John's vocals. Reverb or echo wouldn't be right, and recording outside would be too difficult to contain the sound. Geoff Emerick came up with the idea of recording John's voice, then playing it through an organ speaker and recording the result. Emerick broke into the circuitry of the speaker, and when the sound of John's voice came out of the organ speaker, the Beatles were amazed. The organ sound effect begins on the 3rd verse. This was a perfect example that the process of recording was in itself a process of creating. The lead vocal was then double tracked artificially, as John hated recording a second vocal. To do this, they simply delayed one of the channels. It saved hours of studio time going forward. John was blown away by the double tracking effect. He tried to get his head around how it worked. He asked George Martin, "Tell me again how it works." From the first day of recording Tomorrow Never Knows, George was talking constantly about adding a tampura, a 4-string sitar sounding instrument that creates an ambient sound rather than a melody. He felt it would be the perfect accompaniment for the track. One day George appeared staggering into the studio carrying a case the size of a small coffin. Under its weight he could barely walk. He displayed the instrument to everyone and then stated, "What do you think of that then?" When George had arrived, he parked his Porsche right next to the steps of EMI so he didn't have as far to walk. When he walked in, he threw his keys to an engineer in reception and told him to move his car to a proper spot. The man was terrified he might accidentally scratch the car. For the song, just one single note was played, with Emerick turning it into a loop. When the song was released, it was met with confusion and ridicule by critics and fans. Next, they began work on Paul's song, Got to Get You Into My Life. The song is best remembered for its unique brass section, but it was first recorded with George's lead guitar after each verse.
Right, I didn't know what I would find there.
Much later on, 2 trumpets and 3 saxophones would take its place. Emerick at this point had realised he couldn't rely on textbook mic positioning. The Beatles were demanding different sounds, and with different sounds came different techniques. For the song, he placed the mics inches away from the instruments. The song featured some of Paul's strongest vocals on the album, and while recording them, John came out of the control room to give him encouragement. Paul would later admit, Got to Get You Into My Life was a love song to marijuana, like somebody might write a love song about chocolate or wine. Next, they began work on George's first contribution, Love You Too. The song was currently titled Granny Smith after the apple. George never had titles for his new compositions, and it was Emerick who came up with the early title. The song was also George's first Indian composition. They went through several takes, with each growing more and more complex. The first take featured just George playing acoustic guitar and Paul adding harmony.
You don't get time to hang a sign on me.
The sitar was added later, with Indian hand drums played by an Indian musician, and a fuzzy guitar was added. George instructed the musician to improvise and play in a Ravi Shankar style. After recording was finished, George took home a rough demo of the song to listen to. It was these sessions where George began to mature as a musician. He'd pushed for more songs on the album, most likely because of the royalties involved. George Martin, however, was unsure of George's songs and didn't like taking up too much studio time recording them. He would later regret how George was overlooked in the studio. Back at this point in time, singles were more important than albums. They would be replayed constantly by DJs, thus fueling album sales, and most importantly, they were affordable. It was George Martin who insisted they had to do new recordings, not just lift songs from an album. So as well as writing groundbreaking albums, the Beatles were also having to write hit singles. At this time, George Martin was sent a memo from EMI and told a new single was due. John and Paul would bring their compositions and the strongest would win the prize of A-side. Second place would be relegated to B-side, or failing that, placed on the album. One afternoon, Paul walked into the studio, went over to the piano and called out, "Gather round lads and have a listen to our next single." John gave him a strange look and the three walked to the piano. Paul began hammering down on the keys and singing lines about wanting to write paperback books. Every time Paul reached the chorus, he stopped and said, "That's where the high notes would come in." It was obvious to everyone the song would be a hit. Paul had came up with the idea of paperback writer when his aunt had complained that he only wrote love songs and he should write a song about a horse or something. Disgraced DJ Jimmy Savile would later claim he was the inspiration for the song.
So John is sitting next to me on a settee and Paul is getting shaved, a mirror. And John says to Paul, "We're doing that record on Thursday." Paul said, "Yeah." And I said, "It's your turn to write it." He said, "Yeah. He said, it's Tuesday now." He said, "Yeah." "Well, what are you going to write about?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "Well, think of something." So Paul wrote around and he said, "I'll write about that book he's reading." And that's how Paperback Writer came to be written. Wow.
At this time, Vox had finished work on their latest amps for the group. 4.7 series 120 watts would be used for their upcoming US tour. The amps were transported to Abbey Road and used for the recording of Paperback Writer. For Paperback Writer, Jeff Emerick converted a loudspeaker into a microphone and recorded Paul's bass. Emerick worried the bass was so strong it might make the needle jump out of the groove when played on vinyl. It didn't, and Paul loved the sound. Paul had at this time switched from his Hofner bass to a Rickenbacker. Reason being, he much preferred the beefier sound. The same bass technique and guitar fuzz was applied to John's song Rain. The song would feature on the B-side of the single. When they began recording Rain, they went over and over backing tracks. They just couldn't get it to sound right. Eventually, they came up with an idea. Jeff Emerick recorded the group playing at a fast tempo on a sped up tape machine. When they slowed down to normal speed, it gave the track a murky, deep texture. As the Beatles all owned tape players, they were given copies of their work in the studio to listen to at home. Lennon took home a tape, but due to his inability to understand technology and being very stoned at the time, he threaded it backwards. Of course, John didn't realise it was his fault and put it down to engineer Phil McDonald messing up. Fortunately, John actually liked the sound it was making. He appeared in the control room the next day and told everyone to listen to the amazing new sound. He requested it be put on the song's fade out. To achieve this, George Martin played John's vocals backwards and added it to the end of the song. They all loved it, and from then on, they had to listen to everything they recorded backwards to see how it sounded. On the 17th of April, they began on one of John's songs about Charles Roberts, a New York doctor who prescribed psychedelic drugs to his friends. It was the first time drugs were almost directly referenced in a Beatles song. Following this, work began on You Don't Get Me, later retitled And Your Bird Can Sing. In later sessions, McCartney and Harrison would work out the guitar leads in the studio. April 25th, work begins on George's second song, Taxman. This was his most memorable and strongest song of the album. He'd written it after George had a meeting with the band's accountant. George was beside himself when told how much tax he was actually paying. He found it ridiculous how everything was tax deductible. In frustration, he wrote about taxing the street, your seat, the heat, and taxing your feet. He even suggested you declare the pennies that are in some cultures placed on your eyes after you die. The others quite liked the song, they enjoyed the humorous message, and so it was awarded the opening track on the album. The Taxman sessions, however, did not go smooth. George had such trouble playing the solo, he practiced for 2 hours. McCartney and George Martin became tired of waiting, and Martin stated he wanted Paul to play the solo. In contrast, Paul got the solo down in just a few takes. The next song they began was Paul's composition Eleanor Rigby. Paul first played the song on acoustic guitar for the group. George Martin decided the only accompaniment it needed was a string section. Paul didn't like the idea. He felt the cellos and violins would make it sound cheesy. George Martin argued he could write a perfect string arrangement. Paul compromised, stating, "Okay, but I want the strings to sound really biting." In order to achieve this sound, Emmerich placed the mics inches away from the violins. Any bum notes would be picked up. Musicians were not pleased. As Emmerich placed the mics next to them, one of them remarked, "You can't do that, you know." During the recording, frustrated, the musicians kept moving their chairs back from the mics, and Emmerich had to keep moving the mics closer after each take. Eventually, George Martin got annoyed and told them to stop moving off mic. When all was said and done, they did a great performance, albeit annoyed. They declined to listen to the playback afterwards. Following that, the group took a week off. May 1st, John is relaxing at his Kenwood home before he suddenly remembers it's Magic Alex Mardas's birthday the next day. He states, "Fuck me, Magic Alex is coming round tomorrow and I haven't got him anything for his birthday." He quickly went through possible gifts before remembering Alex being amazed by John's sports car. He then states, "Let's give him the fucking ESO then." When Alex arrived the next day, he was very pleased with his present. It was a year previous John introduced Paul to Magic Alex. Alex had first moved to England from Greece in 1965. Working as a television repairman, he first caught the attention of the Rolling Stones. He showed them his box with flashing lights and claimed he could create a light effect that went on and off to the sound of their instruments. The Stones thought this would be a great feature when performing live. They took him up on his offer, but when Alex set the lights up, they didn't work. Alex argued they synchronised some of the time, but not all of the time. Though, most likely, this was just by chance. Either way, the Stones were not impressed and no longer required his services. After a meeting with John Lennon at an art gallery, he was able to wow John with his electronical expertise. At Paul's home, John announced, "This is my new guru, Magic Alex." Paul was taken aback with Alex and the inventions he claimed to be designing. Paul was sceptical but didn't want to come across as rude. He later stated, "We didn't want to call anyone's bluff. It would have been too aggressive, so we just let him get on with it." Although Magic Alex promised impossible, even laughable inventions, he was by no means stupid. George Martin admitted Alex was certainly clever, a good electrical technician. The problem was, he was simply out of his depth. The Beatles returned to the studio May 5th and the group began recording John's composition I'm Only Sleeping. George Harrison decides he wants to play backwards solo, and the whole day the others listen to him go over the same 8 bars. Next, they begin work on Paul's composition For No One. It was a melancholy song written after an argument he had with Jane Asher. The song featured a horn section, and Paul as ever asked the musician to hit a particularly high note. The man, Alan Civil, was reluctant to even try. He insisted it really shouldn't be done, but Paul's attitude towards musicians was, "You're paid to do a job, so just do it." The man gives in and goes away from the session pleased with his performance. For the backing track, Paul plays piano and Ringo accompanies him on drums. There are no parts for John or George, for No One at the time was compared to his earlier hit Yesterday. At this point they begin work on the inevitable Ringo song. John and Paul would write a song and try to make the vocal melody easy to sing with his limitations. For this album, Paul had brought in Yellow Submarine. The day they began work on it, George Martin was absent. He was at home, bedridden with food poisoning. Despite this, he requests his secretary keep an eye on what's going on and report back to him. The Beatles let loose in his absence. They behave like schoolboys with the teacher out of the classroom. They clown around and take up too much time rehearsing. Had George Martin been present, he would never have tolerated it. They begin messing around more and more and laughing hysterically. Eventually, John tries to restore some order and states, "Come on, it's getting late now and we still haven't made a record." The statement only sends them into even more laughter. Eventually, they lay down the track and the vocals. Both are slowed down afterwards. John feels the song needs to be spiced up, so he begins repeating some of Ringo's lines in a comical voice.
Every one of us has all we need.
Some of John's vocals were permanently erased by engineer Phil McDonald by accident. The engineer was very nervous about John's reaction. John noticed during the playback, and as predicted, he wasn't happy. Following this, recordings came to a halt while George Martin recovers from his illness. When George Martin returns, they continue with Yellow Submarine, recording an opening dialogue from Ringo. The idea is eventually scrapped. 30 years later, the opening dialogue can be heard on the B-side of the Real Love single.
And we will march till 3 the day to see them gathered there.
That day, friends come to the studio to add vocals to the song. When the studio began to smell of marijuana, Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall light incense sticks. Ironically, it's the incense sticks that make it clear to the engineers in the control room what they were doing. Despite this, they don't say anything. They feel it's really none of their business. At one point, Mick Jagger and Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones appear. Emmerich decides to pass out handheld microphones so they could walk around freely. He wasn't going to attempt to get them to stand into position. At one point, John blew bubbles into a glass to simulate an underwater effect. He then gets it into his head that he wants to sound as if he's singing underwater. First he tries singing gargling water. He soon stops after he almost chokes to death. He then begins demanding a big tank be brought into the studio so he can dunk his head in with a mic nearby. George Martin is beside himself and quickly persuades John to try other methods. Emmerich suggests they submerge a microphone in water. The only problem is they need some kind of waterproofing to cover it. George Martin thinks he's gone completely insane, but Lennon loves the idea. Martin agrees to try it, but warns if the microphone's damaged, it will be coming out of Emmerich's paycheck. Emmerich quickly regrets suggesting it. He doesn't earn much money anyway, and the risk to reward factor isn't great. Neil Aspinall heads to Abbey Road's canteen and grabs a glass milk bottle filled with water, and Phil McDonald goes about finding the smallest microphone in Abbey Road. John then asks their road manager turned professional assistant Mal Evans if he has anything they could use. Mal carried around a bag of all kinds of things the Beatles may need: guitar picks, tissues, medical supplies, chocolate, anything they might randomly ask for. As he fumbles through his bag, he has a solution. They wrap a condom around the microphone, lower it into the milk bottle. Unfortunately, their sonic experiment doesn't pay off. The sound is too muffled. Afterwards, to Emmerich's relief, the microphone is undamaged. Though, a broken microphone wouldn't have been the worst outcome. The mic was phantom powered, meaning it could have easily electrocuted and killed anyone in the studio. By the time the solo was to be recorded, everybody was tired. They decided to add a brass section. They didn't want to pay royalties on the brass tracks they used, so Emmerich cut and sliced them up. Luckily for them, the brass solo fits the song well. June 2nd, they begin work on George Harrison's third song, I Want to Tell You. George is still having problems coming up with song titles. George Martin asks him, "What are you going to call it?" George Harrison replies, "I don't know." John then adds, "Granny Smith Part 2. Jeff Emmerich then adds, "Laxon's Superb," which was another variety of apple. Next, work begins on Paul's composition Here, There and Everywhere. It was inspired by the Beach Boys' God Only Knows. The song is a favourite of Paul's to this very day. He first played the song for Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall. It wasn't finished yet and he was stuck for a line. It was Mal who came up with "Watching Her Eyes and Hoping I'm Always There." Paul devotes a lot of time to the song. Hours are spent perfecting its bass line. Though, the standout part of the song comes from the vocals, the harmonies to be exact. They worked out the harmonies carefully with George Martin. Jeff Emmerich later stated, "Martin's real expertise came in harmonising. When Paul records his solo vocal, he feels it sounds a bit too girly." The next day, Paul comes into the studio and begins telling George Martin about an invention Magic Alex is working on. He states, "You know, we're so out of date with telephones in this country, but Alex is working on something. We don't even need telephone directories. I'll be in my drawing room and I'll just say, 'Get me George Martin,' and the phone will hear that and be computerized to understand the words. It will automatically dial your number and you'll be on the other end of the phone and I won't have to do anything about it. It's so simple with computerization and Alex has got it all worked out." George Martin was bemused and told Paul they'd be in hysterics when they see what Alex comes up with. Alex never did present them with the invention. Years later, Alex would complain directly to George Martin about the screens in front of Ringo's drums. Alex states, "Why do you have to put Ringo behind those terrible screens? We know it creates a better sound and stops spills onto the guitars, but it makes him feel claustrophobic." Alex suggests a sonic screen, high frequency beams that would surround Ringo. When switched on, they would create a wall of silence. Obviously, the idea came to nothing. What amazed George Martin most about Magic Alex was how he would often come into the studio, obviously to learn about the technology, and at the same time he would state, "These people are so out of date." Finally, they finished with Paul's song Good Day Sunshine. It was one of the fastest recordings they'd done to date. The final version they would use would actually be take one. At this time, the single Paperback Writer is released. It's now been 6 months since their last single Day Tripper. Paperback Writer, as they all predicted, shoots to number 1. The Beatles at this time had asserted themselves more. They wanted control, more saying how the final product would sound. They now wanted to be present during the mixing process of Revolver. They took more control from George Martin and gave the engineers more idea of how they wanted to sound. As Paul sat listening to the harmonies, he requested louder vocals on certain notes. John and George would normally request more guitar. When all was mixed and ready for mastering, they realised they were a song short. At the least they'd get complaints, at the worst customers would send back the product. Problem is, they were fast running out of time. The album had a release date and they were about to embark on a tour. They would have to be very quick. Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall set their equipment back up and they began work on John's song She Said, She Said. John was never one to take time recording anyway. At the beginning of the session, the song has no title. By the end, they chose to repeat the lyrical hook. It mirrors the song's psychedelic theme. The story of She Said, She Said recounts an acid trip with Peter Fonda. Fonda had told John, "I know what it's like to be dead." The whole song was recorded and mixed in 9 hours. Of all the songs on the album, it sounds the most rough and ready. Geoff Emerick would later resent CD releases of the Beatles records. He'd recorded them to be played on vinyl, and this was how they were intended to sound. With the album finished, the Beatles left London for their world tour. At this point, John's comments about the group being bigger than Jesus have caused a stir. It's decided he will make a public apology. Unfortunately, the release of Revolver will be overshadowed by the controversy surrounding the group. The LSD imagery through the songs gave the drug a celebrity endorsement. Research had turned into recreation. Acid was hailed as a miracle drug. More than any other album, Revolver personified Dylan's slogan, "The times they are a-changing," but it was not quite ready yet to be called a masterpiece.
Thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated as this is my main source of income. Just click the 3 symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and however much you wish to donate. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for my next video.